Hello all, I'm Gretchen Helfrich. You know that I'm an attorney here at Loevy and Loevy. And just about anyone who has read a paper this year has probably come across a story involving police misconduct, shootings, excessive force, even cover-ups. Sadly, of course, these kinds of incidents are not new. And if you know our firm, you know we're a civil rights firm, and you know that we've been trying to fight against that kind of misconduct for a couple decades. But still, there's a sense that this year is different and that the national conversation about the police has changed, that police are under more scrutiny than they have been in the past. Well, today is December 16th. It's nearly the end of the year, and we're going to look back at this year and look at the progress, if any, that has been made on this front. Joining me today for the conversation are Jon Loevy, who is one of the founders of Loevy and Loevy and widely regarded as one of the finest trial lawyers in the city of Chicago. Jon, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Also with us is Jamie Kalven, who is a longstanding client of our firm. We represented Jamie Kalven in a FOIA lawsuit to force the public release of citizen complaints of police misconduct. Jamie's also the founder of the Invisible Institute, which is a journalistic production company. Jamie, let me start with you. Do you agree that this year is different, that people are paying attention in a different way to the police?
Yes, I think both nationally and in Chicago, we've passed over some kind of watershed. It's not clear what lies ahead, but looking back, it's been an extraordinary year. You know, I think we're in a kind of post-Ferguson era in American life, with a sequence of events that have commanded a great deal of public attention, culminating with events in Chicago in the last month. One thing that isn't noted enough, I think, is that there's been no spike in police violence that we're aware of. You know, we treat this, the press sort of characteristically frames stories as kind of crises, and that's the narrative line. Something else is going on. We're trying to bring into focus, and the process is advancing, a set of structural conditions in American life that produce this sort of violence. This is not a departure from the norm. This is the norm. And I think we're in the middle of a process of sort of reckoning with that.
Well, let me press you a little bit. If this year is a watershed, what is it that can't be undone? In other words, what is it that we can't go back to, do you think?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think we have been here before in American history, and I think it's dangerous to underestimate, particularly with respect to fundamental issues of race, our ability to know things and not know them at the same time, and return to a kind of willed ignorance of things that are within our power to know. It's over a year since Michael Brown in Ferguson, so this is a much more sustained period than I think we can point to in the past. Things in the past have been relatively episodic, and I think it's fair to say that the national discourse about these issues reached a kind of crescendo in the last month in Chicago with the revelations about Laquan McDonald, the execution on the streets of Chicago of a teenage boy by the police.
Well, let me ask you, first let me bring Jon into the conversation. Jon, do you agree that something different is going on this year?
I do. I also agree with Jamie that the problem of police misconduct has been stable and is no more or less than it has been in the past, at least in the couple decades we've been doing this kind of work. But something clearly has changed, and that's the amount of public scrutiny and the lack of tolerance for those kind of abuses. What triggered it? Hard to say. Technology certainly had a piece in it. If Laquan McDonald had been shot 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, all that would have survived would have been the police account of a justified shooting, and that would have been the end of it. What's changed, obviously, is a lot more video. People with handheld video, a lot more surveillance video, and even in the police department, things like dash cam. So this shooting is not anomalous. I strongly believe that the problem has been rather consistent, but what's changed is people's attention to it and their lack of tolerance for it. You know, there's been a lot of people that have been frustrated because they believe there's been police misconduct in the past for which there was no accountability. And now that people can sort of see with their own eyes that their hypothesis is correct, they're expressing their frustration strongly.
Well, let me put on a cynical hat for a minute. Two things. One, it seems like we have been here before, Jamie, as you said, We've had trials involving claims of proven torture by police officers in Chicago, and that didn't do it. We've had other incidents of police shootings. We had a video of a off-duty policeman beating the hell out of a tiny little woman. That didn't do it. Convince me that this is not another one of those times where 3 months from now everyone will just go blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah.
I think that's a real danger. I think it's a real possibility. But at the same time, we have an opening. I mean, a historic opening for fundamental, enduring change. It's going to take sustained attention. We're going to have to all bring our best game to keep that opening and to fully realize the possibilities it holds. But I think your skepticism is warranted, and we need to be mindful of the kind of gravitational pull back to the status quo. It's really strong. On the other hand, I never expected to see a moment like this in my lifetime in Chicago. I mean, I think, this is really an unprecedented upheaval. The city has lost control of the narrative, and it's up to us, us being the civil rights bar, journalists, the public, to construct another narrative.
And let me just give a little plug here to Jamie Kalven, because this didn't happen spontaneously. There were triggers for this public consciousness, and I realize that there's been issues in other cities, but in the city of Chicago, it didn't happen overnight. It happened as a part of a process that took many years, and Jamie has been fighting the battle for transparency for close to 10 years now. And when he started, there was just a presumption by the courts and the police department that you can't see documents relating to our investigations of police misconduct. That's super secret, super confidential. The public can't digest it. They won't understand it. Don't ask questions. You don't get it. And Jamie refused to accept that answer and said quite sensibly, wait a minute, you're public servants. You're doing a very public job. And if there's accusations of misconduct, and if there are clusters of accusations, and if there's documents relating to investigations of that misconduct, then that's the public's doing. And that's how we got involved with Jamie. Obviously, we represented him on those cases. But when he started, there was a widespread presumption that the public is not entitled to this information. Here we are. I feel like Jamie has come to the end of a long journey where everybody's finally caught up to him, that this is the public's business, and that's what's happened.
And I appreciate that, and I do think that's progress of a sort. And one of the consequences of that, and through the work with this firm and other supporters and colleagues in this, in early November, we went public with a database of police misconduct information derived from FOIA requests and from the litigation. The critical point about that, and I think this is where things change, is that now there is a common evidentiary basis for debating police reform, appropriate interventions. That never existed before. Before you could choose your facts.
Let me ask you to back up, if you would, and just fill in some of the details about the journey that John's been talking about.
Sure. So this started a long time ago, and for me, it started on South State Street in high-rise public housing, where I was working initially as an organizer and also ultimately as a journalist. And
we can't go back that far, Jamie. We've got to. You got to start the story.
Okay, you want it earlier.
Well,
the point is only that this arose from observing daily patterns of abuse and impunity, and then the question formed for me and for colleagues. What set of institutional conditions would have to exist for what we're seeing from day to day to be the case? How would the world be organized so that this could be going on? And really, both the litigation and my reporting have been driven by that question to this day. Ultimately, in one of the cases generated at Stateway with the help of the Loevy firm, I intervened in federal court as a civil rights case was coming to a conclusion, and asked of the judge that she lift the protective order on various documents and information that had been provided in the course of discovery, saying simply that this is public information. It should not be withheld from the public. And she embraced our arguments, Judge Jon Loevy. There then ensued a 2-year period waiting for the Seventh Circuit to rule, and we got a very hostile anti-press decision that left us an avenue open to pursue the same documents under the Illinois Freedom of Information Act, culminating in March of 2014 in the Kalven versus Chicago decision with a ruling that police misconduct files belong to the public.
And those are the files that now you've put into this database so people can, so when we hear that Jason Van Dyke, the officer who shot Laquan McDonald, had 17 complaints against it, I believe the number was 17.
Yeah.
18. That's information people know because of your database.
Right, and now that's public. I mean, it's been within a matter of days, the existence of this information and the credibility of it was acknowledged by the mayor, by the superintendent. It just became a kind of political fact. That was not true before. I mean, before, one of the things about official secrecy is, in addition to withholding information that we as citizens need to be effective as citizens, it is also a rhetorical strategy. I mean, think, Cheney. If you knew what we know, you would know we're doing the right thing, but we're not going to tell you what we know. And the same kind of game is played at the city level.
And maybe people would take that for granted that this information is now available. The Van Dyke had a number of complaints that they can study. That is a extraordinarily new phenomenon. Had this happened 2 months ago, there'd be no information about his past. Now people can go study it. And our hypothesis in pursuing the litigation that we pursued with Jamie for so long was openness and transparency will force reform. Because now that that information's out there, the police department can't get away with shielding a guy like Van Dyke, and they're going to have to change. So, it's hard to reform a police department. Where do you start? Our belief, which is now going to get tested in reality, is that openness and transparency will force the kind of changes that we need.
John, let me ask you if you have seen any effect of this changed public attitude about police misconduct. Has that had an effect on the work that the firm is doing?
It's a little new. We haven't had any trials yet under the post-McDonald era, but for a long time, really for the entire existence of the firm, when we went into court, everybody was skeptical of us. We're accusing police officers of misconduct. We represent civil rights plaintiffs who sometimes are less than sympathetic. Those are the people who get victimized. And these are hard cases that, people find it counterintuitive that the police would do anything wrong. That appears to have swung a little bit, and I think, hopefully people will be more open to the possibility that there was misconduct, if there was misconduct.
Let me ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, because sometimes I feel like people don't appreciate the extent to which lawyers who are trying to argue to prove that a police officer did something wrong are facing this huge presumption, in a sense, a presumption on the part of a jury, on the part of a judge that, no, the police officer, that's just too horrible to think that a police officer could have done something like that.
It is hard. There's a reason there's not a lot of civil rights lawyers. These cases are hard to win. The average juror, for proper reasons, walks into the courtroom with respect for the police and a belief that they are upholding the law. And, we do this kind of work, but I don't ever want to get mistaken for being anti-police. We have a tremendous amount of respect for the police. They have a hard job, as it's often said, and they're trying to keep our communities safe and trying to enforce the law. The problem is they're human beings, and so it's not even like that there are bad police officers out there. There are some people who might be good people that you'd want to have a beer with who sometimes make mistakes. And in their profession, Gretchen, if you screw something up, we're all going to live to fight another day. But that's a very important profession, which is why we respect them so much. So if a police officer makes a mistake, or if a police officer is inclined to abuse and the system doesn't have any deterrence and no check, then the stakes are real high. So,
yeah, no, I completely agree. And actually, one of the striking things in our data that I often say to the press, it doesn't get reported as much as some other facts, is upwards of 80% of the officers covered in our database of the police force have between 0 and 4 complaints in their entire careers. Roughly 90% have less than 10 complaints in their entire careers. So we're not talking about a few bad apples. That is a misleading image. We're talking about a subset of the department, fairly small as a percentage, but significant in absolute numbers, who have remarkably high numbers of complaints. The behaviors are highly patterned. It happens in groups. It happens in certain neighborhoods and not in others. It happens to certain victims and not in others. It happens to certain assignments, often under the color of the war on drugs. And so we know all sorts of things about this. The failure of the investigative agencies and the department to look at those patterns, to connect the dots, to turn the data into actionable knowledge, creates conditions of impunity for those officers who are disposed to be abusive. And that's where we're not just talking about Jason Van Dyke, the officer in the Laquan McDonald case. We're talking about the institutional conditions that allowed a Jason Van Dyke.
And the world is a gray place, and gray in the sense that sometimes it's hard to tell what's right and wrong and what's true and what's false. But one thing that I feel fairly confident saying unambiguously is what Jamie just said, which is that the existing system for disciplining and preventing police misconduct and punishing it when it happens doesn't work well in the city of Chicago, and hasn't for a long time. If you are a police officer who's inclined or disposed toward abuse, you can act with a very high degree of confidence that you're acting with impunity, that no other police officers are going to call you out on it, and that even if you do get complained against, nobody's going to do anything. You're not going to be disciplined. You're not going to be fired. And we read in the news recently about Glenn Evans, sergeant who just got prosecuted. He's an example of what happens when someone who apparently is disposed to violence and nobody calls him on it, and his supervisors look the other way in the name of enforcing crime, then it starts to build on itself and get worse and worse. And when people ask me, what's going on here, why is this not changing? My answer usually is, in the city of Chicago for a very long time, no politicians have been willing to spend the political capital to make the change, because IPRA, they changed the letters. It used to be called OPS, but aside from changing the letters, nobody has made structural and real changes that would make deterrence more real. And I think they've gotten the mayor's attention, and I suspect that they're going to take a genuine look at that for the first time in a while.
Is it fair to say that in Chicago, people who have looked at this problem, and there are people who have been looking at this problem for a long time, know what needs to be done, what sorts of changes need to be made?
I think that's largely true. One of the things we're going to do after the first of the year is assemble an anthology of various reports going back to the 60s that have been issued on issues of police abuse. They're consistent in their recommendation, in their diagnosis and their recommendations. So again, I think this goes back to your skepticism. Not only has the problem been in plain sight, but the solutions have been in plain sight, and we haven't acted on them. I mean, we don't need yet another task force or commission. We obviously the DOJ intervention is welcome, but we know a great deal about how to fix this. And if you'll indulge me, I think it's a few really obvious things.
I will. Please tell me what they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's what Jon was saying about transparency, more information. I think that's what everybody should be clamoring for right now. Every day there's a new video, there's a new disclosure of one sort or another. That is a very healthy process. As ugly and disturbing as what comes out, there's an absolute necessity for real reform, that we know everything and that we can be diagnostically smart. The accountability system is not flawed. It is not broken. It works to antithetical ends to the public interest. This is a system for not knowing things that the city's capable of knowing about fundamental human rights abuses against citizens. It needs to be dismantled, rebuilt, and there are ways of doing that, and it really is not beyond us to do that. The third thing, and in some ways the most challenging, is to take on the code of silence. Every police executive deplores it. None of them address it. And that involves real leadership. It involves changing the disincentive structure for officers and really making good on that. And the fourth thing is the Fraternal Order of Police, the union, is part of this larger machinery, and the city needs to go back to the bargaining table. There are provisions in the union contract that are damaging to the public interest and public safety. I mean, police deserve to have a robust union to represent them as workers, but not the levels of protections that, gum up any investigation.
Jon, let me ask you this. We're litigating cases all over the country. I just recently sat down with David Owens, who has just started a case down in Houston involving the shooting of Jordan Baker. Are any of these problems unique to Chicago, but more importantly, are they problems that have to be solved nationwide, or can Chicago fix its problems, and each place has to fix its own?
It's an interesting question, Gretchen. I think our community stands and falls by itself, and if the citizens in our community feel trust with the Chicago Police Department, and if the Chicago Police Department gets serious about instituting some of the changes Jamie suggested, then I think things will heal in our city. And I think whether Houston or other cities take those steps is not going to cause our system to rise or fall. In fact, there are some places where it works pretty good. In some cities, the police make it a priority to have good relationships with the communities, to not tolerate abuses, and to not tolerate a code of silence. In those places, they don't have the kind of problems Chicago has. So, the fact that we're all in the same country is, fortuitous.
So I would say, in response to your question, Gretchen, that it's a national problem that only has local solutions. That's not to say that different jurisdictions can't sort of cross-pollinate, that good ideas can't travel, and I think that will happen already with our database, the Citizens Police Data Project. We've been approached by New Orleans and by the Police Monitor in New Orleans and by the Sheriff's Department in LA County, wanting to explore, working with us on similar projects. So that's an example of, the kind of cross-pollination. There are national issues in terms of reporting standards and things that can happen at the federal level. But mostly this is going to happen, innovation and models of the best standards of performance are going to happen in particular jurisdictions. Chicago has, though, I think, a unique role to play in that I think we're now, with the Laquan implosion and the federal intervention, kind of at the epicenter of what's happening nationally. And I think it's a reasonable expectation that DOJ coming into Chicago is really looking to establish a national template for what police reform looks like.
Jon, let me ask you whether you share the same list of priorities that Jamie Kalven has for police reform in Chicago.
I think he summarized them well, and I just wanted to maybe elaborate a little on the code of silence, because that's a term that gets tossed around. But doing the cases that we do, we have been involved in literally several hundred cases against the city of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department over the years. And invariably, if a police officer is accused of misconduct, the other police officers that are involved in the situation close ranks. Nobody ever implicates anybody. Nobody ever admits that anybody ever did anything wrong. And I'm willing to allow that, maybe we don't bat 1,000. Maybe every case we've ever brought was not completely justified because you don't know what really happened. But we pick them pretty carefully, and we choose cases where we believe a real injustice has happened, when we have corroborating evidence, witnesses, physical proof that the police officers maybe used more force than they should have or shot somebody when they shouldn't have. And juries have agreed with us, it happens a lot. And in all those cases, no police officer, to my knowledge, ever has said, I saw something that wasn't proper. And that's a problem. There is no room for any police officer to say that another police officer did something wrong. And, many of these witnesses are honorable people and honest people, but there's just an awful lot of pressure, apparently, to toe the company line, regardless and without exception.
So that's directly spot on. And one of the things that's struck me about the Laquan McDonald situation, now we have definitive evidence that police officers on the scene lied about what happened. It's in the police reports. Think about it, though. The initial responding officers who came in response to a 911 call and managed the Laquan McDonald situation for some minutes before he made his way to 41st and Pulaski and was killed by Officer Van Dyke. They handled it in an exemplary fashion and humanely. They had a feel for this kid. They get to 41st and Pulaski. Van Dyke jumps out of his car, blows him away, blows Laquan McDonald away. I think it's fair to assume that those officers, other officers on the scene, responded as you or I would to what they witnessed, as people all over the city and the world have to seen the video. And then they're required by the de facto terms of their employment and the code of silence to lie about what they saw. It's hard to imagine more toxic working conditions than that.
And I would make that the last change. I remember reading in Boston, a new chief came in and said, you know what? We got a new rule. You lie, you're done. You're fired. If you lie in a police report, you lie in court, you lie to your supervisor, we're going with a truth regime and without exceptions. And that, if you ask any criminal defense attorney at 26 in Cal, that would be a revolutionary change. I mean, it's almost like assumed that, hey, you're trying to get convictions, you got to bend the truth. Is it too much to ask that you had a police department that said, we are not going to tolerate any police officer saying things that are not true?
So will you guys come back a year from now and tell me whether you got what was on your Christmas list?
You have a date?
Sure, Gretch.
Jon Loevy is one of the founders of Loevy & Loevy and widely regarded as one of the best trial lawyers in the city. Jamie Kalven is a client of Loevy & Loevy and a founder of the Invisible Institute, which is a journalistic production company. Jamie, can I ask you to give the website of the database? Because people can go online and take a look at these complaints in your
so
database.
the name of it, just Google the name. It is Citizens Police Data Project. And I urge everybody to take a look.
Okay, thank you both.